Hello, everyone, and welcome to the W2 Amigos podcast, where we talk about passive investing, real estate, and all the money moves you can make while working your W2 so you can establish your financial freedom. Here to talk about their W2 journeys, your hosts and amigos, Nick Coulter and Xavier Marin. Nick, what is up, man? Who do we have on the podcast today?
So we have the one, the only, the Craig Curelop, our lead agent on the FI team, which I'm a part of. He's the person that wrote the book on house hacking strategy. He does not claim to have invented it, but he did write the book on it and all the strategies to help people invest. He's got a really great story about his W-2, some challenges as he transitioned out of the W-2 realm into owning his own business and then scaling his real estate portfolio. So super excited to have you guys take a listen, hear a little bit more about Craig's story. I feel really honored because it's someone I get to connect with all the time. But when I first started the financial independence journey, I looked at him as this like Herculean figure that I was like, oh my God, Craig texted me back or messaged me back on Instagram. And now I get to chat with him all the time. So I'm really excited for the leaders or the listeners to be able to hear a little bit more of that raw story from him. But tell me, X-Man, what do you think you're taking away from the episode?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I took away was he talked about listening to the person that you want to eventually become, which was mind-blowing when he shared that, because you'll hear during the podcast about his journey, about the background noise that he was listening, right? So he's getting feedback from his family, from the people around him. And ultimately, he made a decision like, I'm going to listen to the person that I want to become. So he started listening to those individuals, like who's already house hacking, who's becoming great agents. He was listening to those folks versus the folks that did not have no knowledge about real estate, no knowledge about house hacking, no knowledge about finances. So I think that was really important to talk about, because at the end of the day, sometimes we end up listening to people that either really haven't done it or are not executing, right? So sometimes we take a look at, hey, who should I really be paying attention to following? The people that are probably 2-3 steps ahead of you.
Yeah, I loved it. Let's make the listeners love it too. Let's get them in here. Let's not make them wait anymore. All right, everyone. Welcome to the W2 Amigos podcast. We are here with the one, the only, the Craig Curelop, the FI guy. We like to affectionately call him the Craig Kerplop over here because he makes such a splash every time he's interviewed. So without further ado, Craig, tell us about yourself, man.
Yeah, man. Does this mean we're like the three amigos? Just Trace Amigos? Isn't that like an alcohol or something?
It means now, yeah. We're definitely the Trace Amigos now.
Trace Amigos. I love it, man. Yeah. Well, hey, thank you so much for having me on the show. Super excited to be here. And I guess I can take you guys all the way back to, when I started my first W-2, which was actually in California, Palo Alto. I was working at a venture debt company. For those that don't know what venture debt is, I'm sure you've all heard of venture capital. It's basically the same thing, but rather than getting equity in a company, we're just giving them a loan. We were basically like hard money loans for startup companies that were losing tons of money. We give them a loan till their next equity round. Sounds really fun or not. We were looking at some cool companies. Like we looked at like Dropbox, and Facebook, and Angie's List, and all these kind of like cool, sexy things that were like really big back in the mid 2000 teens. And it sucked though, right? Like I was really, what it looked like for me was I was just drowning in a spreadsheet, working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks. And I just like absolutely hated it. Maybe you guys can relate. Maybe some of your listeners can relate. And so what I basically discovered is I kind of took a step back. And I was like, where am I going to be in 10, 20, 30 years? If I stay in my current role, I could maybe move up the corporate ladder, which basically entails that I move 30 feet down the hallway into an office where a guy is there in the office 50, 60, 70 hours a week. He's not able to spend time with his family. He's only able to take 2 weeks vacation a year. And there's just no way I was going to live my life that way. And so that's when I figured, okay, I need to figure out a way how I can get out of this rat race. How can I retire early? And that was about 6 months into my W-2 job. I basically stuck it out for another year or so before actually discovering Bigger Pockets. I kind of was like, maybe this is a thing, maybe it's not. I discovered Bigger Pockets that was in late 2016, like July 2016, August 2016, I discovered Bigger Pockets for the first time. And then I was just lost, man. Like I went down that rabbit hole and I was like shouting from the rooftops to everybody at work, to my friends at work, to my boss. I literally grabbed a beer with my boss and I told him about my whole plan. And he was like, cool. good luck. Like, did just in one ear out the other. And that was when I knew that was my journey, man. Like from there.
So it's interesting that you mentioned like you looked down the hall and you saw what that future looked like. We recorded something yesterday. We talked about some topics and we talked about the tech layoffs, and that will have aired by this point. But one of the things that I found interesting about that is a lot of people in that world make a shitload of money, but then they don't have the backup plan in case anything happens to that income source because they've never planned. They always thought it was going to be there. And they looked down the hall and they saw someone making $500,000 and they're like, oh, I can do that forever. But then they had no security, no protection.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, what's a job, right? JOB, just over broke. Once you lose that one stream of income, you have nothing, right? Unless you've been saving like crazy or investing, which is what we're encouraging everybody here to do. And the funny thing is I actually forgot about this until you just mentioned this right now. Right when I quit, there was layoffs at my company, and probably like 4 or 5, including the guy that took me out for a beer, all lost their job. And so I have no idea where they're at now or what they're doing, but I'm pretty sure they weren't investing in real estate. So I'm sure they had to quickly get another job so they can make their $1 million house payment.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You kind of said something that's been like resonating with me recently. When you started having those conversations with everybody, like screaming the financial independence and investing in real estate from the rooftops, did people start treating you a little bit differently at work? Were you like the odd person there that's like, well, why would you want to do that, Craig? Why not just spend all your money like we do?
People I think the people I worked with were pretty nice overall. So I didn't feel like I was being like shunned or anything, or maybe I quit before I got to that point. But one of my best friends was like, real estate might be for you, man, but it's not for me. I find a lot of fulfillment in giving companies lots of money so that they can make it to the next round, and then they can go and change the lives of millions and millions of people. I'm like, okay, like if that's what floats your boat. And so that's kind of when he almost like kind of sucked it to me, where I was like, you know what? I don't need to shout this on the rooftops to people that don't want to listen. This place is clearly not a place where people want to listen. So I'll mention it. I'll bring it up to where people are going, but I'm not going to force it down people's throats like I kind of was at that job.
And Craig, just out of curiosity, when you talked to your boss about your plan, and he was pretty much like, okay, cool, whatever, good luck. If you had a boss or a leader that showed genuine care, if you weren't working 80, 90 hours a week in that job, do you think you'd still be there or actually would want to grow with that company?
Probably not. Maybe I would be with my boss, right? Because that guy actually left. And the company has a big, long history too of not being ethically moral, and that's a whole other thing. But I think at some point, like I wasn't made to sit in a desk all day to work 100-hour weeks to make 60 grand a year when my boss makes 600 grand and his boss makes 6 million, right? Like that, those were literally the numbers of what they made. And I was just like, I can't, that's just not who I am. And so, maybe I would have, if they were to listen and they were to support me, maybe I would have made another year or two, but that was actually, maybe them not listening was more of a blessing because it got me out quicker.
So it's funny you mentioned getting out quicker. Where'd you end up next? I mean, obviously you left that job because you don't work there now. So what's the next part of the story?
Yeah. So I worked there from when I graduated college until April of 2017. That's when I got a job at Bigger Pockets. And so most of you guys probably know what Bigger Pockets is, but it's for those that somehow don't, it's a massive community of real estate investors. And I was like the biggest fanboy of all time. In early 2017, I had listened to every podcast. I've read every book that they come out with. I got an interview with Scott, and I had to go on a lunch break from my job. I literally went to the library. There were no spaces available. So I was like, luckily it's warm. It's like semi-warm in California in March. So I was like tucked in, like in behind a plant in the garden, closest to the building as I can, like having this interview with Scott. And, and just because I was so passionate for the company and so passionate for real estate investing, and also because I knew a thing or two about finance, I became a valuable member of the Bigger Pockets team.
So did you pick up and move?
Yeah. So April 2017, I picked up from California, moved to Denver, and then from there it's that's where that was the biggest inflection point in my life right there, is getting that job at Bigger Pockets. Moved to Denver. That's when I started to be able to house hack and do all those things that have, got me the success that I have today.
So did you start house hacking before or after joining Bigger Pockets?
So I was in talks with a lender prior to Bigger Pockets, but I didn't close on my property until 2 months after I started at Bigger Pockets. So I got to Bigger Pockets on April 2017. I closed on my first property June of 2017.
Nice. How did you first discover the strategy behind house hacking?
So Brandon Turner wrote an article in 2013 that was something along the lines of how to hack your housing and live for free. And that was the genesis of how the term house hacking was born. And I don't think I read that article. I think I was just listening to the Bigger Pockets podcast so frequently. And at that time, there were a little bit more newbies on. And I was like, yeah, I went down the wholesaling route, I went down the flipping route. And I was just like, oh, house hacking is it's like the easiest way to build wealth. And you're actually building substantial wealth for the long term. I'm not just working for one deal. And so it became a no-brainer. At that time, though, house hacking, the only way to do it, or the only way really known to do it, was to buy a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex for 3.5% down. Right? It was only the traditional method. I feel like I'm not going to give myself all credit for this, but after I came out with a book on the house hacking strategy, the rent by the room strategy started make more sense for a lot of people. That short-term rentals became all the rage during or just after COVID. And now medium-term rentals are kind of the big thing. So house hacking has definitely had its evolutions. And no matter which way you swing it, whatever way you do it, it just works.
Yeah. So, I mean, how could you have read about house hacking if there was no book that you didn't write yet on the house hacking strategy?
How could I have read about it? I know, right? Who would have
How
thunk?
could you know? Like, there's no way.
Yeah, it's just podcasts, man. Like, I was obsessed with podcasts. I was obsessed with reading. I was reading 60 books a year at that time. And so, you read enough books, you listen to enough podcasts, and you've got all the information that you need. You just got to piece it together and figure out what works best for yourself. And so it made the most sense that house hacking was the most popular way or the best way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's great to hear that background, Craig, because I'd like to always hear the story behind people that started house hacking before it truly became a thing, before it truly took off, and just hearing everyone else's experience. Because to your point, you had to figure it out. Today, if you start house hacking, there's books, there's more articles, there's podcasts, there's like step-by-steps of how to be able to execute it. So yeah, it's really cool to kind of hear your background, your story behind it.
Yeah, and just like you said, there's way more information out there. And everyone always says this, right? There's way more information out there now than there was when I started. So anybody doing this now should have a lot more success than I had, because you won't make the same mistakes that I had.
It's interesting. So for all the listeners, I know I talk about this a lot, but I'm on the FI team, right? So I'm on Craig's team, the best real estate team to help investors find their properties, and also regular buyers. But little shameless plug there.
Love it.
I read the book, and I literally was reading it in Virginia, and I was like, oh shit, when I move back to Southern California, I could buy a house and then get like my bedrooms rented out, and then I don't have to pay for a mortgage. Like, that sounds awesome. And so I literally read the book, bought the house, and then messaged Craig, and I was like, hey man, I'm going to rent out my rooms. And he was like, that's awesome. Who's this random person hitting me up on IG? And then I realized that I didn't really pay a lot of attention when I read the part about the actual listing. So I went back and I read line by line and basically copied every word that you put in there about, you want to list that you're this far away from bars and this far away from downtown, and how to attract young professionals versus people who are just going to party and destroy your place. So the resources are there, and it was a lot easier for me because that content was out there available. Kind of bringing it back a little bit. So you got approved for the loan while at Bigger Pockets. How did you leverage that job to try to, propel you into the position you're in right now?
Yeah, for sure. So Bigger Pockets was, again, it's a huge inflection point in my life, not just because I moved to Denver and cut the house hack, but because I was working at Bigger Pockets and I tried to leverage that as best as I could. Maybe it was unintentional at the time, but looking back, I'll say it was intentional. So while at Bigger Pockets, obviously, lenders love that W-2 income. So I was easily able to, I think I was able to get a $400,000 place at the time. I ended up buying a duplex for $385,000, listed at $400,000, but we negotiated them down. And so basically what that was, it was a top bottom duplex, 1 bed, 1 bath each. And it was 1.5 miles from the office, Like that's basically the reason why I did it. It was I could bike or walk to work. It was totally redone, so I didn't have to put any work into it. I could rent it out immediately, and it was a duplex, which is what I really wanted. And so my mortgage payment on that was about $2,200. I rented out the top for $1,750, and I was living in the bottom. But I really was determined to live rent free. So if you know my story, this is probably like the most funny part. So I rented out my bedroom on Airbnb, and I was making $1,100 a month off my bedroom while I slept out in the living room behind a cardboard box and a curtain room divider on a futon. And I did that for a year, and that made it so I was making $2,850 on a $2,200 mortgage. So I was cash flowing like $600 a month over the mortgage and living rent free. And so I was like, yay, I did it. This is what house hacking is.
So it's so funny. I've heard so many people be like, when I talk to them about house hacking and they know your story, they're like, well, I'm not living behind a curtain. I'm like, that's not every situation of house hacking. That's one particular extreme example.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely don't have to live behind a curtain. But at the time, I was 24 years old, single. And I was like, this is like, I'm going to take advantage of my flexibility and the fact that I have almost nothing to my name right now to like leverage it and do it as much as I can with it. And so it seemed like the obvious choice to me.
Yeah, for those that are listening, you chose to do that. You could have paid $450 in rent, right? You could have paid that difference. So for a lot of people, that might work. What I really love about that first house hack that you shared is you bought it for the convenience for you, right? It was really close to Bigger Pockets. You liked the location, and it was a duplex. Like you made that work, and it was already turnkey. So that was just kind of like, that's an example of kind of like almost a perfect house hack for you personally. So where you still live in the area that you want, the house that you want, the price that you want. So that's pretty cool to hear.
Yeah. Not to mention, like, I'm not going to like glorify, like it was great. The location was great. But I will not glorify living on the couch. Like it wasn't as bad as people think it is, but it also wasn't, I'm not going to pretend like it was unicorns and rainbows. Like, yes, I was woken up in the middle of the night with people coming in and out, like 100%. But most times people go to bed at normal hour. They wake up at normal hour. They're super respectful of your place. Usually just like a couple that's really respectful coming in and out. So it's not as bad as people think it is.
Craig, did you have a timeline in mind? So you mentioned that you did that for a year. Did you already have it before you started like, hey, I'm only going to do this for a year? So it kind of gave you somewhat of like light in the end of the tunnel, like, hey, I'm going to only have to do this for 12 months.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it was a 1-year plan for sure. And funny, the last 2 months I actually went away on an extended break, which is besides the point. But yeah, so it was exactly 1 year that I was going to do that because I just did the math, right? Like, okay, well, I was paying like $1,500 a month in rent before this, or I don't remember what I was paying, honestly, maybe $1,000 a month in rent. Plus I was saving about maybe $2,000 a month from my job. And so if I just do that math, I'm now saving $3,000 a month times 12. That's $36,000 a year, which I could definitely use as a down payment for my next house hack with some buffer. And so I said, yeah, I should be able to do this in a year. That doesn't include any bonuses or any other things that I would get. And so by the time year 2 came around, I was more than ready for house hack number 2.
Yeah, so I think it's really important for people to realize there's a comfort continuum there. And I know you address in your book, we talk about it quite a bit, but when we first got back to California, Evelyn and I were heart set on getting a house, living in the master, because our level of comfort could be, hey, we're going to share our home with strangers, but we wanted to make sure we had our own bathroom, so we could go there real quick since we were married. We have a dog and a cat. And then now we upgraded into that super expensive house in San Diego where it was a 1.45 purchase price. I put $217,000 down. So like I'm broke now. So that story's real broke as hell right now. But then we opted to live in the studio because it's 360 square feet, but it's an upgrade for me because I have my own bathroom now. I have my own kitchen. I have my own living space that I can the cliche, I want to walk around my own house naked. I could actually do that. Mm-hmm. I'm sure my wife prefers that I don't, but like it allows me to be comfortable in an extent that is good for me now. And then I will be able to rent out our front house, which is the main house. It's a 4-bedroom, 2-bath on Airbnb. So we're doing that now. However, I don't want to do that when I have kids. You know what I mean? And so like when we go and we strategize for the next couple of years out, we just have to plan accordingly to say, that's where we're going to be. We need to be more on the comfort side and less on the profit side to make sure that we're able to like set the long-term ability to house hack.
Totally. I love that, man. It's exactly kind of like, I started off living behind the curtain and then I went into like, okay, renting out a room. And then I rented out, just I lived in the upstairs and rented out the downstairs. Like once you kind of have a significant other that they want their own space, you can still house hack, but it just has got a different flavor to it.
Absolutely. All right. So Craig, what happens next? So you're here, you're at Bigger Pockets, you're in Denver, it's getting snowed on, which is like a terrible decision instead of staying in SoCal. But then you started to build a business kind of outside of that. So what was the process to get there?
Yeah. So exactly 1 year later, I bought my second property. This is kind of when the whole rent by the room idea was like, oh my God, this is the way to do it, right? I can have my own bedroom. I'm making actually more money. And yeah, like that's great. Right. Like, and so I was just living in a 5-bedroom house with 4 others, and it was totally cool. Right. I was kind of used to that. I've always had roommates. I've always been living with somebody, and hey, at least I had some privacy now. So I did that for a year. And then, year 3 comes around, and this is kind of when things really start to change. So the first property is not going to make you super rich. The second property is going to make you more rich, but like the power in house hacking and the power in real estate investing is getting more than one property at a time. Not at a time, but there's more properties in your portfolio. And so once I got to the third property, that's when I realized, okay, I've got about $3,000 a month of passive income. My expenses are so dirt cheap because I'm house hacking, because I bike to work, because I do all these different things. I'm financially free right now. And so because I've had some level of success with house hacking, I had a buddy of mine. He asked if I could help him with his first house hack as a real estate agent because I got my license. And so I was like, yeah, sure. Like my intent was never to help other people. My intent was always just to I'm just gonna get my license for myself, and I'll just keep building year after year after year. But I helped my buddy out, and it was actually really fun going to see houses, helping him run the numbers, and giving him like all the resources I had for to help house hackers and just investors make their way. And at the end of it, I got paid a hefty commission. Like I got paid like 10 grand. And I was like, oh, well, that was pretty easy. It's probably the easiest 10 grand I ever made. And so I was like, oh, maybe I could like do something with this. And so then I started, like the word started to get out that I was representing other people. And then people started coming to me, oh, hey, you're in Denver. Like, would you be my real estate agent? And I'm like, hell yeah, I would. And so I started helping people out, right? So while I was working at Bigger Pockets, I started helping people out as a real estate agent. Shortly after I made that decision to be a real estate agent, the book, The House Hacking Strategy, came out. And then word spread even more that I was a real estate agent. And so because I kind of became that expert in house hacking, people were like, well, who else would I go to help me find a house hack but the guy who wrote the book on house hacking? And I'm not trying to there's plenty of people very well qualified to help you find a house hack. I'm not saying that I'm the only one, but obviously I've got some credibility there. And so I was doing like 2 to 3 deals a month while working at Bigger Pockets, while working a full-time job with no help. So I was just like crazy working hard. And do that math, right? About $10,000 a check times 2 or 3 checks a month. That's $20,000 to $30,000 a month I was making on top of my salary at Bigger Pockets. The only thing is my salary at Bigger Pockets at the time was like $84,000. So do that quick math. I'm making $7,000 a month by giving them 40 hours a week, 160 hours a month, versus part-time, I'm making $30,000 a month. Like, what is that? Like almost over four times that amount. And so it was a no-brainer that I was like, okay, I think I'm financially free because I've got my rental properties, so I can go ahead and leave this job. And even if my real estate company, my real estate agent fails immediately after I quit, like I still can at least stay afloat for a while. And then, so on January 31st, 2020, I quit, or I like to say I graduated from Bigger Pockets because, again, like no bad feelings with them whatsoever. I still do a lot of stuff with them. And then I started becoming a full-time real estate agent.
That's awesome. I want to rewind real quick. First, I love how you say that when you got your second house hack, they're like, oh, sweet, I get to have my own bedroom now. Because again, because we were just talking with Nick, right? It's like, oh, okay, I'm going from like living in, rented by the room. Now I have my own studio, my own bathroom. Like that was great. So it's a funny plug right there. What were folks around you saying during that time they were taking this journey, right? So you acquire your first one, you're pretty much living behind the curtain. Now you have your own bedroom on your second property. You get your third one, you become an agent working for Bigger Pockets. Like, what was that noise around you like during that time?
Oh, dude, this is such a good question. And everybody needs to be aware of this as you go in this journey, especially if you're not in a community of people already doing this. So my parents were like, what are you doing? You making good money. Why are you sleeping behind a curtain? Why are you renting? Like, you can live by yourself. Why don't you just be like everybody else? And I was like, this is not my life. This is just a few years while I build a good foundation so then I can live the life of my dreams. My grandfather, I love him to death. He took me aside and he had a few drinks in him. So he might have been, he's a kind of like a tough love kind of grandpa too. He's like, he basically called me a miser for living on the curtain and renting everything out. And I was like, that is not who I'm trying to be. It's just for a year or two while I build a foundation again so I can get to a better place. And so I had to deal with all that noise, right? All the people that I loved and gave me advice my whole life. I kind of had to be like, well, you worked till you were 65. My parents were still working. It's like, I don't want to, I love you guys, but I don't want that for my career. So why would I take advice from you? Right? I'm going to go take advice from the Brandon Turners of the world and the David Greens of the world and the people that I actually want to be like, and the people that I actually that are where I'd like to be, because they've already done it. They know it. And so, Brandon was telling me to house hack. Scott Trench was telling me to house hack. Dave Myers, Jay Scott, like all these people that I looked up to at Bigger Pockets were telling me to house hack. So I'm like, oh, no brainer. Right? I'm going to listen to these guys. These guys are all multimillionaires.
Yeah. What would you tell our listeners? Because to your point, your closest family, people around you were telling you one thing, and obviously the other folks you were surrounded with were telling you the other thing. How do you draw that line? Like, how do you know which one to gravitate towards? Because it's kind of hard to personally to be listening to like your family's feedback and be like, well, am I truly making the right decision? Like, what was the level of comfort like, or what helped you determine like this is exactly what I want, despite what I'm hearing in the background?
Really, it's just a matter of, is whoever is giving you advice where you want to be? And so if your mom and dad are still employed and they're still working, they're not the ones to give you career advice unless you want to work until you're their age, right? And that's not to say you can't take other advice from them or you can't take their advice with a grain of salt, but you need to take advice from multiple sources of people and figure out what you think is best for you. Like, obviously, like my parents, like I've taken my advice from them. They've got me to a certain point, but I don't take financial advice from my parents anymore because, like, again, love them to death. But they take financial advice from me now, right? Because now I'm the expert in the finances. Well, now when it comes time to raise kids, I'm going to go to my parents for advice because they've got 30 years of experience of raising kids. I've got 0. And so it's not to say I don't ask my parents for advice at all, but it just doesn't make sense to ask somebody for advice if they're not where you want to be. And your parents are always going to want you to be safe. They're going to want you to do what's tried and true. They don't want you to take those risks because seeing you fail is so great to them. But I promise you that, like, most people that don't care if you fail are going to tell you to go for it. And those are the people you actually need to listen to, because if you're young listening to this, and by young, I mean you're 30 or under, or even if you're a little bit older than that, you've got nothing to lose. Like, go and like lose money on the deal, right? Just go get that experience, because the experience you learn from that will make you so much more in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the times that I learned the most sometimes is when I'm having to pay a cost to it, right? So with the cabins that I own for my Airbnbs, my long-term rentals, like I've learned a lot of lessons because it had to cost me money. And typically sometimes that's what it takes for you to move forward.
Totally.
Cool. So Craig, you mentioned that in January 31st, right, 2020, you graduated from Bigger Pockets. Walk me through those first 3 to 4 months, because as we know, right, 2020 was one heck of a year for all of us. And I think around like March timeframe is really COVID started picking up quite a bit. So walk me through your thought process during that time when you're hearing COVID, you're hearing government shutdown. Are you kind of going through your mind like, damn, did I just make a mistake moving on from Bigger Pockets and doing my thing full time?
Yeah, it was interesting. That was a fun time. I feel like I was so busy I didn't even realize it. So January 31st, 2020, like COVID was a thing in China, but it wasn't. I was kind of like, oh, it's not coming here. Like it's just going to be like SARS or Ebola or like all those viruses that kind of happen. Like it's not going to come here. And so I was kind of just like in denial. And then end of February rolled around and it was like, oh, first cases in America. And I was like, oh, shoot. And then, of course, March, all know what happened in March 2020, all the shutdowns and stuff. But by that time, I had two or three people still closing every month. I was starting to hire my first person, which was a transaction coordinator. And when I hired her, my business kept growing and growing and growing. The book had come out, so my Instagram was starting to blow up. And so people were still like, oh, I want a house hack, I want a house hack, I want a house hack, even through COVID. And actually, I got a little bit lucky because during COVID, there was a time there about from the mid-March to like mid-May where you couldn't do showings. But in Denver, like some markets, they shut off to the whole showing platforms. But in Denver, they didn't shut them down. They just said you couldn't do showings. There was no enforcement. There was nothing. So I basically went to the buyers and was like, well, showings dropped off 88%. And so I was like, well, 88% of people aren't doing showings right now, which means our competition just went down 88%. If you're cool, I'll wear a mask. I'll stay 6 feet apart. Like, when everyone thought that actually worked, but that's besides the point. And we'll just go see the houses. And if the sellers are okay with it, we can make it happen. And so I would tell the sellers the same thing. Hey, like if you want to sell your house, most people aren't doing showings right now. Ask the land if you feel comfortable with that. And so we were just getting people under contract left and right because there was no competition. It was like heaven for like 2 months. And then of course, prices came back, interest rates dropped, showings started happening again, and then things just skyrocketed.
Hey, Craig, so I think now is a great time to kind of hear a little bit about what your total portfolio looks like and a little bit about the background on how you kind of scaled into those properties.
So I've house hacked 5 properties in Denver and ended up selling one of them. And then I met my wife through house hacking, and I was her realtor. And so she had 2. And then I also bought a traditional like 20% down rental in Denver. So total of 7 properties in Denver. It probably works out to like 12 or 13 units. A lot of them we made into duplexes. We've got 6 single family rentals in North Carolina, 2 plots of land in Florida, one of which we're building on, and we'll build on the other one soon enough. That'll be a short-term rental, and also my parents will be retiring there as well. We are house hacking up here in northern Idaho, so now we kind of bought like more of like the house of our dreams, but we had a basement with a walkout, so we're going to be Airbnb-ing that, and we're under contract, about to close on our first rental in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. So that's about my portfolio.
So that's interesting. So you house hacked 5 times. Met your wife there. I'd love to hear more about that, like some sketchy realtor coming in and like hitting on this poor person trying to buy a house. But so that's cool. How do you manage all of these? Do you do property management, or do you still do it all in house?
So it's all property managed. My favorite way to do it is through what's called Airbnb arbitrage. So X, I'm sure you know about this. Nick, I'm sure you do too. But rather than me be the person renting, I'm actually the landlord. And so somebody rents from me for a premium. They save me on property management costs. And then they go ahead and put in the house on Airbnb, and they keep all the profit.
So you're like first landlord I think that I've ever heard that's wanted to like offer up their property for Airbnb arbitrage. Why is that? It's just because it's easier for you and you get a premium?
Yeah. I mean, I get guaranteed rent. That is $1,000 more a month. Plus, I'm saving about $500 a month on property management fees. So the net difference in my pocket is $1,500 a month. I don't have to worry about reviews. I don't have to worry about tenants not being able to get in. I don't have to worry about small fixes. Like, it's still being managed, so it's still passive for me. But I've just squeezed out an extra $1,500 a month. Like, that's material dollars. So I love it. Yeah. If anybody wants, yeah. I'm like so open to like, yes. Like, I don't know why more people aren't doing this.
I love that. Craig, did you leverage? So I know you mentioned you had 5 house hacks. You have a couple in North Carolina, Idaho. How were you able to scale throughout your time with your properties, your house hacking in Denver? Like, did you use any particular strategies, or did you just save up from your W-2?
A lot of the house hacks were just saving up from a W-2. I had a lot of success as a real estate agent that year in 2020, as I kind of alluded to in the interview here. And so a lot of those were just 20% downs on cheap properties out in North Carolina, 70, 80 grand houses. So, I'm putting down like 20 grand or so per property. And so that's how I was able to kind of scale up quickly that way. And then, just kind of leveraging the other properties, taking HELOCs out, refinancing, all that kind of stuff.
Nice. Did you ever end up taking like a 401k loan or anything like that to fund any one of your properties? Because I know that's something that I did for me personally to acquire like one of my out of state rentals. I'm just curious to see if that's something that you ever leveraged.
No, I didn't. Never took a 401k loan out. Something that I thought about doing, but then I was like, okay, that's good to have in my back pocket if I need it. But ultimately, I didn't want my 401k. I think it was like a 4% return you give yourself. And I just didn't want my 401k to only make a 4% return. So that was kind of like the input. That was like, it's like, I mean, great. If I need it, I'll use it all day, but I never needed it.
Awesome.
Sounds good. X, you ready to transition to our regular standard questions?
Let's do it. All right, Craig. So I got the first one here. So what's one piece of action a listener can take after listening to this podcast?
Quit your W-2 job. Just kidding. One piece of advice or one action.
The complete opposite of we're preaching here on this podcast. Like, oh, try to leverage it as much as you can.
Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, your W-2 job is really valuable, especially when you're first starting out. I would just say, like, if you've got 20 or 30 grand in the bank, like, get engaged with a real estate agent in your area and start looking for a house hack. Even if you're like close to the 20 or 30 grand, you're not quite there yet. Like, just start getting houses, start analyzing deals. So that way, when the time comes where you've got that 20 or 30 grand, you can put 3% down or 5 or 3.5% down or whatever it is. You're ready to take action. You're ready to move. And there's no like learning period. This is your learning period.
Yeah. I think that's super important because like I don't know, maybe I've had a different experience, but it sounds like you've had the same, Craig. Like being a landlord in a house hack's pretty easy. It's like pretty mindless. I show up, I put very little work into the property now that I have tenants, and it costs me nothing, but it saves me almost all my living expenses combined.
100%.
All right. Question number 2. How has your W-2 allowed you to achieve some of your financial goals in life?
So the W-2 really allowed me to get my first 3 house hacks. That's what got me to financial independence. Not only that, but my W-2 was pretty synergistic given that I worked at Bigger Pockets. And so look to see what opportunities your W-2 job has. And so obviously Bigger Pockets is a behemoth in the real estate investing space. And so I asked them to write for their blog. Usually people have to go through this whole vetting process to write for their blog. Because I worked for them, I was able to bypass that. And I started writing for my first blog article came out like a week after I started working there. And for the first 2 years, I was just writing for their blog, not on their time, on my time. But I had the opportunity to do that. And that allowed me to build a little bit more of a brand for myself, which then leveraged into the book, which then leveraged into the business, which it all just kind of compiled onto each other for everything else.
Love that. What's one thing that you would do differently with your W-2 income?
One thing I would do differently with my W-2 income. I was always reluctant and hesitant to pay for any sort of coaching or masterminds or anything like that. And so I would say find yourself a group. Don't be afraid to pay like in the thousands of dollars because you will reap those benefits and rewards very quickly and your business will scale much faster. I was always like working for Bigger Pockets and working alongside Josh Dorkin, who's very anti-guru. Was like, if anybody is charging you over $1,000, like it's not worth it. And like they're just trying to save your money. And so that was like embedded in my head. But after kind of seeing all the new masterminds that have been coming out in the new kind of like groups of surrounding yourself with higher achieving individuals, you're able to grow much faster if you've got some mentorship.
So now are you ready for my weird question, Craig?
Oh yeah. This is what I've been waiting for.
Yeah, so we're going to make it money related. I'm going to make you have to make a choice, Joker style. Would you rather win $25,000 yourself personally or have your best friend win $100,000? And I don't want to hear you be like, my wife's my best friend, so I take the $100,000. I don't want that answer. Non-wife related best friend.
I would rather have my best friend win $100,000. Because then I could be like, yo, I'm going to make this decision. You're going to win $100,000, but I need you to give me 50 and you keep 50. So in the end, we each win 50.
That's true. I mean, that works out. I'm going the same way because then like if that money goes to X, then we don't have to have him edit anymore. And so we can outsource that. It's like super easy to do.
Well, I was going to say like, I'd do the same thing. And like, hey, Nick, let's just throw that into an Airbnb for us.
Yeah. It's just a partnership. Yeah.
Go buy like $1 million property in Florida or something.
Or I hear Idaho is
cool.
also
I mean, those are all the questions that Yeah, I've been hearing that Coeur d'Alene name tossed around a lot recently. I got to figure out what's going on with that.
Yeah, come on up. We've got a lot of corn or potatoes and potato museums if you're interested.
How could I not be? All right, Craig, thank you so much for the time today. I know I get the pleasure of being able to chat with you multiple times a week, but I think our guests are really going to take away a lot about how they can scale some multiple streams of income and then protect themselves and insulate themselves with financial independence for the long term. So appreciate the time, but I know there's going to be a lot of them that want to get a hold of you after the fact. So where is a good place to reach out to the FI guy to find out more about him?
You just said it, man. You can reach out on the FI guy on Instagram. It's going to be the best way to reach out. I try to answer all my messages, but sometimes they do get lost. So feel free to reach out multiple times if I don't answer. And yeah, that's basically the number one way. And if you are looking for a house hack we'd love to be able to help you. So thefiteam.com, we got a bunch of investor-friendly real estate agents that are here to coach, guide, and mentor you, including our all-star Nick, who's out in the SoCal area. So surf's up, bro.
Yeah, even though we're like 2.5 hours inland. Yeah, surf's up. Yeah. Hit me up by a house. Cool. Like I said, Craig, really appreciate the time, man. I can't wait to see kind of like where the team goes and some of the stuff we're able to do to help other investors get started. So thanks for sharing.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much. X, great to meet you. We'll talk soon.
All right, everyone. That was our wonderful guest, Craig Curelop, the FI guy. Really dropping some bombs on us today. What'd you think, X?
Loved it, man. I love listening to his story from this perspective. So someone I've been following now for a couple of years, and I was actually part of his breakout session at the first VPCon in Nashville in 2019 when his book barely was coming out. And just to kind of hear a little bit more like the background stories and the details during the time that I was, following him, what was really great to see and actually meet him in person.
Yeah, I think, it's funny. I think the listeners can really take away the house hacking aspect. He was like, what piece of action can you take right now as a W-2 investor? He said, hey, try to save up to the point where you have 25 or 30 grand down and then go buy a house hack. And again, I say that a ton. I'm sure people think like, oh, it's because Nick's a house hacking realtor and he wants to sell people properties. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of it. However, when you hear it from Craig, it's, it really is, it's insulating you from the exterior forces in the world, right? So if you don't have as much housing expense, you can afford to work a lower paying job with more upside, or you can afford to move companies and go after passion projects. So I think it just insulates you away from a lot of stuff that's happening in the world and allows you to kind of live the life you want to live, which is really powerful and cool.
Yeah, what I loved is he pretty much took control of his life. You listen to the interview, it's really great to hear. Awesome that he was able to be as successful as he was, especially leaving his full-time job pretty much a month or two before COVID happening. So I love that guy.
Yeah. All right, guys, that was our wonderful episode. If you can, please drop us a rating and review on whatever platform you are getting your podcasts from. We would greatly appreciate it. It allows us to hit more ears, jump in the algorithms, and then also make sure that we are hopefully connecting with more W-2 investors to convince them to start to change their lives. If you're looking to connect with me directly, hit me up at the FI Family on Instagram and TikTok. And then if you want to get the hold of your W-2 amigos, we are extremely active on Instagram, TikTok, and also YouTube. And that is the W-2 amigos. What about you, X?
You can find me at XavierMarin _ at Instagram and TikTok. We appreciate you guys tuning in, and until next time.